As we've heard, the Rotary Club of Denver was chartered December 1st, 1911. So 2011 is our 100th year. We were the 31st club of Rotary International, and since our founding, there have been many changes in our city, in our culture, and in our Rotary Club. It is trite to say that the only constant is change itself. But there, I said it. We can celebrate the fact that leaders like Barbara Pahl, Regional Director of the Mountains Plains Office of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, have successfully worked to save historic places and thereby revitalize communities in changing times. Mrs. Pahl has been a distinguished leader to the effect that she has helped to save important landmarks and buildings so that following generations will be able to appreciate the work and design of their forebears. She came to the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 1984 as the Assistant Director, and then she became the Regional Director in 1991. She has held this position ever since, and in this role, she worked alongside fellow visionaries Dana Crawford and Denver attorney Steve Hart. One of their first cooperative efforts was to save the DNF Tower. Cities who destroy all their old buildings are less interesting than ones who recognize the importance of historic treasures. But now, the Trust is incorporating advanced eco-friendly concepts. The Trust is seeking LEED Gold certification for the renovation of the historic Emerson School, located at 1420 Ogden. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy Environmental Design. The rating system is the most distinguished and widely accepted green building certification in many countries such as Brazil, Chile, and China, to name a few. So while the past is celebrated, the best of the new is included. Barbara grew up in Rochester, New York. She received her BA in American Studies from Skidmore College and MA in American Studies from George Washington University. Her resume supports her passion for our need to appreciate the knowledge of our American history, and in addition, she lives out this passion, not only in her work, but she and her husband are restoring an historic home on Observatory Park. She is obviously a centered, well-focused woman whose passion is a gift to us all. Please welcome Barbara Pahl.
Thank you, Lee. It's an honor to be introduced by somebody who has more passion for more subjects than anybody I know. Can you hear me? It's kind of wobbling around a little. I have been in Denver since 1979, and one thing that I know about Denver and I know about Colorado is the citizens of this state and our city love their history. But what you may not know, and the story I'm going to share with you today, is the role that you folks have played, not really the role that I played with the Trust, but you and many of your colleagues have played in really making preservation happen here, but across the country. It's a story I've been dying to tell. Ed Crabtree gave me the opportunity to tell you all today, so here we go. So let's get started. To do so, I need to create a little context for you all. This is Mount Vernon. Hopefully you'll recognize that. And in the 1850s, there was a proposal from the Washington family, it was John Washington, to sell Mount Vernon to developers so they could tear it down and build a hotel there. Thanks, that would help a lot. And then along came this lady. This is Anne Pamela Cunningham. We all revere Anne Pamela Cunningham. She is the birth mother of the historic preservation movement. She got in touch with other ladies of the South. They created the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. They raised money in every southern state to purchase Mount Vernon from the Washington family and to preserve it today, and it's still owned and run by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And that was the beginning of our story. And quite frankly, it was really the first private preservation effort that began in this country. The National Park Service, who many of us think of as being the entity that leads the preservation movement, and on the governmental side, in fact, they do, really didn't get involved until the Antiquities Act was passed in 1906 by Teddy Roosevelt. And one of the first parks not to become a monument, but to become a national park is our very own Mesa Verde. It became a national park on June 29th, 1906. This is even before the National Park Service was created, which didn't happen until 1916. And many of the first places in our American past really were the antiquities that were placed here by Native Americans. We didn't really get to saving places that are associated with more European settlement until the Historic Sites Act was passed in 1935. And Independence Hall, which one might have suspected might have been one of the first national parks, wasn't actually made a national park until 1948. So a lot of the activity really was somewhat run by the government, but also driven by private efforts. At the same time, there were communities getting involved early on in preservation. This happens to be in Charleston, and they were the first in the country to have a local historic district, something we do here in Denver quite well. But Charleston's the one who really got this idea started, and they were quickly followed by New Orleans. They wanted to protect the Veau-Carré and did the similar kind of thing of passing historic district zoning in 1936. The National Trust, the organization that I work for, was chartered by Congress in 1949. And initially, the role of the trust was to try to take property a little bit quicker than it could be considered by Congress to become part of the national park system. And so in the early days, that's in fact what we did. This is just a few of our properties: Drayton Hall in Charleston, Lyndhurst, which is in Tarrytown, New York, the Glass House, Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. And as many of you may know, we also recently created a partnership with the Colonial Dames to include the Hotel de Paris in Georgetown is one of the 29 properties that the National Trust either owns or is in partnership and running. And the Hotel de Paris is the only property associated with the National Trust in that fashion in our Mountains Plains region. Well, the big game changer here, really, for preservation movement happened in the 1950s with the passage of the National Interstate and Defense Systems Highway Act, signed by President Eisenhower in 1956. And that really was transformational in terms of the changes it made in the American landscape through the building of this highway system across the country. It was followed, this is just to give you an idea of how the landscape changed, it was really followed by urban renewal, which was another post-World War II activity in this country. After the war, Americans looked around, saw a lot of blight in their cities, and Congress got several pieces of legislation passed to try to help revitalize downtowns. And although it wasn't initially meant to be the massive demolition that it came to be, that's in fact what happened. This is Boston, Detroit, and of course our own city of Denver. This is Denver in the 1930s. You can see how dense it is in lower scale. It's a closer picture. Good, huh? Not so good for those of us who care about historic buildings. And of course, when I moved to Denver, this is a lot of what it looked like still in the 1970s. A lot of parking lots, some cranes. This was the idea that if you tear it down and you scrape away these old buildings, that developers will quickly follow. And then we all know we still haven't built on all those empty lots that were really torn down by Durham, Skyline, urban renewal projects. It doesn't look like that today, but there's still places where you can see this. And of course, the demolition that occurred here. Well, as you can imagine, people like me got kind of grumpy about this idea. And they began protesting on the streets. This is actually a shot from Washington, D.C. that created a group called Don't Tear It Down. After this guy's it's a very simple idea, don't tear it down. But the idea and the government policy were not at all in sync. And the government policy really in those days was about pumping a lot of federal dollars into both the creation of new highways and really the destruction of a lot of our American cities across the country. But it was really this one that really got everybody's attention, and this was the demolition in 1965 of Penn Station in New York City. This had been designed by McKim, Mead & White, really an elegant building. I think even Jackie Kennedy paid attention when this one was coming down. And this led to a group of mayors from across the country coming together and looking at our own American past, going to Europe and seeing how they had been able to, over the centuries, save more of their historic building fabric than we were doing here in the face of this. And they wrote this book, With Heritage So Rich. And the National Trust published it in 1966. And in this book, they kind of examined that private effort that had gone on since Anne Pamela